All right, joining me now is Jeff Schlosser, the Executive Vice President of Bell Helicopters. Jeff is a retired Major General with a distinguished 34-year military career to include commanding the 101st Airborne in Iraq and also in Afghanistan. And Jeff was Deputy Director of the National Counterterrorism Center and was the first director of the War on Terror Planning Office within the Department of Defense following 9/11. Hi, Jeff.
Hey, how are you today, Dana?
Very well, and we'll say hello also to Jimmy Blackman, the author of Pale Horse, Hunting Terrorists in Afghanistan, and most recently the book Cowboys Over Iraq, and I love that title. It's about leadership in the airborne cav over Iraq. Jimmy is a combat veteran, and he lectures extensively and is very valued on any topic on leadership. Jeff, if I can start with you, I mean, we are in a crisis like no other. It is surely time for toughness, true grit, guts, resolve, and all of that stuff. But it's also a time to be very sober and wise about surviving from a business perspective, isn't it?
Dana, right now, the tendency for business leaders is to focus on the crisis, and you get into a tactical mode, just trying to manage it. In fact, what leaders have to also do is try to understand what is the future opportunities and challenges and then plan for that future. And it takes a balance.
And a very difficult balance. Jimmy, I know you're a gutsy guy. You're a combat vet of the skies. And, you know, what are you telling business leaders and professionals right about now?
Yeah, so the challenge has been they're having to lead remotely now. One of the big challenges is how they communicate, prioritize, and focus their people when they can't huddle them in a room necessarily. It's amazing how many people have become proficient using virtual means such as this now out of necessity. Of course, you know, a crisis like this forces us to learn a lot about ourselves, and businesses are learning a lot about themselves and leaders and how they can connect and align their folks while not being able to huddle them up necessarily. So over communicating and being very clear and specific in priorities.
News correspondent, I mean, I was in Afghanistan, you know, probably a couple dozen times, and probably one of the highlights for me is flying in a Black Hawk helicopter with you, Jeff, over areas of peace, but also of war. And we talked about the surge in violence and the Taliban attacking all over the country. You had how many soldiers under you then?
So when we started, about 25,000, and when we left, 37,000. And as you recall, I went and bet my stars and said we needed more resources in spite of Iraq ongoing, and we got them from the administration.
The pressure, if you can compare it to what people are going through today, it must have been enormous. Did you just soldier on, or do you keep adapting strategy and to a rapidly changing and complex problem, much like a pandemic now?
Yeah, so exactly the point, Dana. So we would soldier on, and I would have a small group, we call it current operations, and Jimmy knows this well, that would focus on what happened that day, and then how it would change that week. But I also had a team that was focused on what we call future planning and future operations. And I met with them all the time to try to understand what we were going to do in the coming couple of weeks. It's critical that business does that same type of thing. In other words, manage the crisis, but focus on that future, because that's where your opportunities are. But it's also where you can really screw up if you don't make decent plans for it.
Jimmy, you were also there in Jalalabad, I understand, close to the Pakistan border. And is there some parallel to flying combat missions and fighting now a virus that is grinding nations into financial ruin and killing people?
Well, I think the ever-changing situation is a common theme. They're calling this the age of disruption, and our business battlefield. It's the rate of change that seems to be so different. You know, if you could humor me for just 1 second, knowing we were going to do this, I went and looked this up because Jeff and I have had an opportunity to discuss this in December, not this specific, but this topic. And this kept coming back to me in December of 1862. Abraham Lincoln wrote a letter to Congress, and this is just a couple of sentences from that. He said, "The dogmas of the quiet past are inadequate to the stormy present. The occasion is piled high with difficulty, and we must rise with the occasion. As our case is new, so we must think anew and act anew. And so I'm encouraging guys to think of, Einstein, we don't solve our problems with the same way of thinking that created them. We have to think anew.
Jeff, you're at Bell. You sell military and civilian helicopters all over the world, including China. Has your business model just flipped upside down? And then when you listen to Jimmy about, okay, weathering a new storm and doing everything anew, I mean, in practical, that sounds great philosophically, but in practical terms, how do you implement something like where you just start your business almost from scratch and yet not? You're still selling helicopters.
Yeah, so that's a great question, Dana. So let me give you a solid example. One of the things that we found out is that over the last 2 months, by working remotely, I call it a distributed workforce. In other words, we're distributed globally. But
I like that.
Yeah, but after we found that there are certain categories of our business where the productivity has actually gone up by a significant factor, right? So now we've got to embrace that. Generally speaking, we're not a company that would love to have people not work together. And generally we would keep them, at our workplaces. But in fact, we're reevaluating where does productivity really get enhanced by working, in a distributed way. That's just one single way of taking a hard look at what we've been challenged and say, you know what? We can save money on facilities. We can save money on a whole variety of other capabilities.
But you must still scratch your head at the end of the day, all of you. And I know that there are some pretty big thinkers at Bell and some smart people. I mean, strategically, how in the world do you navigate all of this? For instance, you manufacture in China, don't you?
We do actually. We sell in China and we train in China. So we're not involved in the defense community there in China, but we have helped establish the emergency medical service flight capability. And to do that, it was basically a green field, Dan. We had to go on in and we actually said, we got to train helicopter pilots because they didn't have any. And so we started a training academy there in China. And there's no doubt that in the future that we'll be doing, production potentially in that country as long as relationships remain. But you're absolutely right that, you have to grab hold of these opportunities. And so there's other things out there that we're going to be, saying, what, Bell can do this, and this is giving us an opportunity to get inside that kind of either a new field or a new capability.
Jimmy, there's crisis management for you, right? In just about every company, in every country right now. Could you lecture on 5 steps of crisis management? Can you just kind of very briefly hit the headlines?
Yeah, well, the crisis management, really that model came about from the tactical need, and the model I used was one that we had in Afghanistan. There were times we did air assault operations into Kunar province where we planned and briefed the mission using virtual means, a video teleconference. And I literally picked soldiers up from 4 or 5 different combat outposts to bring together on one mission with one objective. We planned that, we rehearsed it, we did everything distributed and was quite successful in operations. And so we got a lot of military folks out there that have experienced this. It just wasn't in business necessarily, but the same concept.
But Jeff, it's misleading a little bit, isn't it? Go ahead if you want to add something there.
Yeah, Dane, I just wanted to pick up on what Jimmy said. When I reflect back on those times in Afghanistan, just as Jimmy was laying out, one of the things that senior leaders actually have to do in these crisis moments is if you're going to be able to, if you really try to embrace this idea of distributed operations, and right now you don't have a choice, so you better embrace it. What you have to do is empower and then resource, and so empowerment, what I would do is I would initially establish, basically a line of intent between, like, say, Jimmy, who was a squadron commander in our toughest place, and I would go visit him, meet with his staff. He had a great intelligence staff and great operations. And of course, Jimmy's a very wise combat commander. But I would get inside his brain, he'd get inside mine. But then after that, I had to empower him. And it was very uncomfortable sometimes because we placed him in some really tough situations. But you have to empower, and then you've got to make sure they have the resources.
Here's something that puzzled me, because you invited me into Bagram Air Base, which was a former Soviet air base. For people who haven't been to Afghanistan, it's a former Soviet air base. It was taken over by the American forces after 9/11. Huge sprawling air base, but in it you have something called the bridge. And it's a little bit like the Starship Enterprise. And you walk in there and there are all these monitors everywhere, and you see drone feeds, and there are incoming calls. And I know, sir, you were taking all kinds of calls from people out and doing checkups and finding out what was going on the ground. And you know, you did give me the tour and say it was an amazing way of keeping in touch and understanding the battlefield and what was going on. And yet a colonel leaned over to me when I was sitting there and he said, you know, if you spend enough time in this room, much like a Zoom, a much more sophisticated Zoom, but if you spend that much time in a room like this, you actually think you know what's going on. So there's a little bit of danger in all this technical meeting, isn't there?
There absolutely is, Dan. And if you recall, when we were together, so I took you to the bridge, and I took you to, it's a joint operations center. And, you know, actually we have similar things here in business, you know, where we manage crises, you know, crisis room. But the big danger, as you said, and how I elaborated with that is I said, let's go fly. And we went up and we flew in a place called Kapisa, which can be on again and off again, fairly dangerous. Up to see soldiers in our French troops as well as our special operations troops. What you have to do is have the combination of have your staff inside the bridge or the joint operations center helping you to understand that you know what looks to be the situation, but double check, get on the ground. And virtually, as Jimmy's pointed out, that can be challenging. And so now's the time to pick up the phone. After you do your Zoom meeting or your web meeting with 15 or 20 people, pick up the phone and check on Jeff Schlosser and say, hey, Jeff, what's actually happening in your location? Tell me, low down, just tell me what's going on. And have that kind of mutual, kind of a trusting conversation. And that's going to be,
that's very critical advice, isn't it?
Yeah. I mean, that's how we're going to get through this, I think, you know.
And Jimmy, you know, one of the things that I think you lecture about, and it is not unique to your crisis management ideas. I mean, I think every unit, whether it's a tactical command center, you know, for a colonel or a captain, or you head on up to generals, the biggest thing that I saw with the U.S. Army, unlike any other army, and I've embedded as a reporter with lots of them, including the Russian Army, and which is an altogether different experience, and that is that this after action that takes place after a mission or after something has taken place, where you get together and you very quickly, it doesn't go on for hours, but you very quickly say, what did we get right? And more importantly, what did we get wrong? And anybody can talk in that meeting, as far as I understand, and they can challenge a superior. And the idea is to be honest about it and to move forward and learn. Am I summarizing that the best way?
Absolutely. I mean, that's how learning, growing organizations thrive. As you said, you have to, you know, take the rank off and have thick skin, kind of the ground rules up front, because that's how we learn and grow. And, you know, a method that I like to use in all the ones that I facilitated was I would go to the restroom and look in the mirror before we started and say, what did I do to fail my soldiers or this organization? And I found that when a leader's vulnerable up front and owns mistakes, it opens the door for others to stand up and say, you know, I could have done this better. And you're right. A lot of organizations, businesses do it when something goes catastrophically wrong, but we should be doing it when things go well. So we develop new best practices as well.
Jeff, you were a major general and you had a lot of people serving under you. Does it get difficult to park your ego at the door and have that conversation?
Dana, you're probably absolutely right. The truth is, if you do an AER, and you know, I've done many both in business, but clearly in combat, If it doesn't hurt and it doesn't nudge you a little bit, then you're probably not getting an honest, assessment of your own performance. I mean, I came up, as Jimmy knows, started off in Air Cavalry, and then eventually, actually, I started up blowing stuff up as a combat engineer, and then Air Cavalry, and then the 160th Special Operations, they have a reputation of just giving brutal AARs, where the youngest soldier can turn around and say, you know what, sir, you really screwed this decision up, and this is the impact that it had on the rest of the mission. And we took that into the 101st and all the outfits. Guys like Jimmy had it already in his background. And absolutely, you've got to park your ego at the door or in the bathroom, as Jimmy said, and really encourage honest assessment. Sometimes people are not going to give it to you unless you prod them, unless you really say, you know what, I know I made a mistake. Here's the mistake. And the people will eventually try to pile on. And you can eventually learn from that a significant amount that will help your business.
It's important to have that person around you that'll tell the king when he's naked. I fought for what would be my COO, my S3, going as a brigade commander in Afghanistan. If it wasn't for John Campbell, I wouldn't have got him out of a fellowship in time. But I wanted him specifically because of his candidness with me. I knew that he would tell me what I needed to hear, not what I wanted to hear. And what a lot of companies are finding out in this crisis right now is who's truly important in their organization, what positions right now. And a lot of bosses, quite frankly, I think are being surprised at how little they matter, how their companies are really running in their absence very well. But we're seeing some of these key positions in companies emerge as vitally important. So then the question has to become, do I have the right talent leveraged against that position with the right resources and the right guidance? And so that's a very strategic way of thinking, of really looking at your business, both in the tactical and the future plans, as Joe Schlosser mentioned earlier. What are those vital positions, and are the right people in the right seat on the bus with the right portfolio, as Jim Collins would tell us? That's critical.
If you're talking about the right people, then the right leaders, what should leaders be doing right now? I mean, I've heard things like, big ideas and strategy, communicate that through the organization, overseeing implementation of big ideas. But I guess big ideas have to be open to drastically upending the classic business model right now. You need a lot of courage right now in business.
Yeah, let me pile onto that right now, Dan. I would say that one thing to pick up on is that when you're communicating, you're not just communicating, life is normal, or hey, I'm feeling pretty good about where we're at. You basically got to be calm and reassuring in times in which, the chaos and crises really have, upended people's lives. And you have to understand that privately their lives are also upended, not just their business lives.
Absolutely.
To do that. The big ideas, as we're talking about, some of them are actually internal. So, I mean, you pointed out, and so did Jimmy, you actually have an opportunity to identify some of your best crisis leaders. Not all of them will always be leaders. Let me take the example that in combat, you could find some natural born or learned leaders that were awesome in combat. If you took them back to the garrison and to a peacetime environment, they were usually bored, or maybe they were not as effective. I know Jimmy's written about a couple of those guys that we know that are close friends of ours. You're going to have that same opportunity here in business to identify those leaders right now that can lead in a crisis. And you need to make sure that you understand what you're seeing, and then be able to place them in positions where they'll be able to excel as we move out of this pandemic. There are positions, by the way, where people who can do that in pandemics can also operate very effectively in normal times, but you have to be careful.
Yeah, just to
It's
pile on
very
that.
tough moving those people around though and making decisions that are affecting people's lives right now when they're already, as you say, under enormous personal pressure.
Yeah, you know, I was coaching an executive of a large company, and he had a direct report that had a lot of responsibility, and he was struggling, quite frankly, prior to the crisis. And he said, I want you to coach him as well. And we gotten to the point where I was unsure if he was going to be the right fit for the long run in this position. I did not think he had the talent and the skill set to do the job. And this crisis happened, and all I've heard are these raving reports from his boss about how he's just thriving in this crisis. And I reminded him of the same thing Joel Slosher mentioned. There were guys that I was, you know, before we went to combat, I was uncertain. I kind of, the hair on my neck would stand up, you know, when I give them a mission, and they got, and there were folks that I was certain would be my rock stars that I got over there, and I was a bit disappointed. So sometimes, you know, it is the right, you know, the right environment that brings out the best in them.
How do you keep good people right now, Jeff?
Yeah, I'll start off with that. And so right now, with your best people or the good people that have, you know, been that bubbled here to the top, you've got to give them a lot of responsibility and then empower them. And they will help your business, but at the end of the day, you're also helping them personally. And because that's how they're going to thrive. This distributed workplace that we have, the remote working, you know, where people are working, especially if they're working from their homes in a singular way, and yet they're leaders. If they're natural leaders, they're going to feel very uncomfortable. It's extraordinarily hard to lead via Zoom or WebEx. It can be done, but you know, again, they're going to be uncomfortable. And so what you've got to do is you've got to encourage them, talk to them individually. Not, I mean, you know, again, this is like talking to a formation when you use a WebEx in the military terms. In other words, it is a way of indirect leadership where I'm talking to a large number of people. You now have got to be able to, as a leader, pick up that phone and say, hey, Dana, how are you doing today? Let's talk about your family for 2 or 3 minutes. Everything going okay? And then transition into what your responsibilities are and how can I help you do that job better? And it's reaching out like that, I think, in a singular way. It's kind of like my battlefield circulation, or what Jimmy did on the battlefield as well. So you have to go check on those troops wherever they're at and see what their perspective is, and then bring that on back to your headquarters.
How do you get back up off the ground in this, you know, horrible economic climate? A lot of people are going to lose jobs, and they're losing them right now. Take this down, just not from the big business executive, but right down to a frontline worker, or maybe a secondary from the front line who is suddenly going to get laid off, or he or she is not going to get reemployed. And you guys have had long careers, and you've I'm sure always looked far forward and wanted to advance and wanted to get promoted. When it took a right-hand turn, what kind of kept you going? And can I ask both of you that? Jeff, maybe you want to start.
Sure. The first thing I think is being human enough to understand that you've got to have some empathy with everybody that's inside your organization, including those that look like you may just had to furlough somebody and it bothers you, it hurts you in the gut. And I had situations like that both in business as well as also in the military. It absolutely hurts. Try to put yourself in their shoes and understand it from that viewpoint. And then do what you can to try to mitigate or to help as best as you possibly can. To the rest of the workforce that you have currently ongoing and stuff like that, they're going to look and they're going to see, you know, the people that are actually either furloughed, they've lost their jobs, their friends or relatives or whatever, and they're going to bring that into the workspace. And you're going to have to be able to talk about it. And you're going to have to talk about it in an open way. I mean, what I've actually seen is that on our plant floors, our productivity is actually going up. People are happy to have a job. We're doing our best to take care of them in a variety of different ways that you'd expect, you know, safe health practices and stuff like that. And they're bringing that on and they're working harder. You know, they're just happy to be employed by a good employer.
Because good people are always in demand. Good people are always, most of them that know they're good and they're talented are confident that they'll get a job somewhere, they'll go somewhere. But this evolution, this change is inevitable. You know, we're seeing. I think we're certainly going to see a commercial real estate crisis here, because companies, as Jeff mentioned when we first started, they're figuring out that not everyone has to be in brick and mortar. Not everyone has to have an office with a desk and a chair. And so we're going to see an evolution. But look, we're constantly evolving and changing, and we figure it out. I mean, by 2016, our economy was 80.9% services. We transitioned from a manufacturing economy to a services economy, and jobs changed. People were replaced with automation, but people adapted and other jobs were created. And I think as leaders, we have to provide that positive outlook that yeah, it may look different. This new normal may be one that looks very different than it does today. But we've been going through this. The pace has just been increased with this pandemic. Again, I would be optimistic and looking for opportunity, not focusing on the crisis that's in our face.
I heard something very interesting today. In fact, a statistic on Georgia opening up, and that only 6% of their business had come back to a lot of the restaurants and that kind of thing. General Petraeus, who you both served with in the 101st Airborne, and who I know just did a lecture at the London School of Economics, and I was struck by something he said, and I'd like to have your opinion on it, because there is a divisive debate in America and here in the United Kingdom and all across Europe and elsewhere in the world. You're either saying we got to stay at home longer, we've got to ride it out, or let's run hot, let's open it up. And General Petraeus said, look, they should not be competing notions, because if you have health, you have confidence, and your employees won't return and your customers won't return unless you build confidence. So you shouldn't have to choose between your personal health and your financial health. Jeff, you just mentioned on your assembly line that your workers, obviously you've gone out of your way to make them feel confident that they can return.
Right. And so, I mean, I think it's a great point that, you know, first and foremost, what you should be doing, I think, in the industries, including the service sector, including the hospitality industry, is one, making sure that your workforce is in fact protected, and they feel, not just feel, but are in fact, you know, treated in a way that allows them to maximize their health. You know, that can go from everything, for example, on our production lines, where when people come to work, all shifts, basically we shoot their temperature, you know, in a non-intrusive way. And if it's above 100.4, we actually bring them off on the side. They talk to a health provider. They do it again after 15 minutes. And if it still is that high, we advise them to go home, and we go through a whole quarantine procedure. We don't have to do that inside of a restaurant, but what you do need to do is take care of your workforce first and foremost. If they feel taken care of, then you can concentrate on your customers. And then the customer is the next part. You know, how do you make a customer feel like it's actually going to be healthy to go and partake in a service, so such as going to a restaurant and things of that nature? You've got to basically think about that kind of, how do you restructure your infrastructure, tables, everything like that? How do you maximize the way that people could still have a good time, have, you know, a good meal, and yet at the same time feel healthy and be healthy, you know, from it? It's a challenge, but it can be done. And I don't see it as a either or, you know. You know, I mean, there's clearly going to be some industries that are going to be challenged for the next 4, 5, maybe more years. And some may not come out the same way. They may come out very differently than what they were prior to this pandemic. But I'm still an optimist that, you know, business as it goes, in the UK, in the United States, throughout the world, is going to have to continue on throughout this pandemic. They can't stop.
Jimmy, do you want to take a prediction on where we are in the next year or 2 years, how this ends or how it doesn't end at all?
Well, I listen to the same news feeds you do, and we're certainly not going to we'll have a vaccine in record time, not in the near future. And I'm an advocate of being smart, but trying to get the economy back going as fast as possible. Four instruments of national power: diplomatic, informational, military, and economic. And from a U.S. Strategic standpoint, our economy is everything. That drives everything for us. I think that engine needs to get started, not just from a business standpoint, as in a personal business owner, but also the economy's importance to our nation and the global power. I also think that it's hard for each of us to truly understand perspective. And for General Petraeus is speaking, a mentor of mine, a great friend, but he's speaking from his perspective. And I don't know how I would feel if I owned a restaurant right now and I was told I couldn't open it and I was struggling to pay the power bill, or I had employees calling me that were trying to figure out how to get on unemployment, or maybe couldn't. That's a very different feeling. And so, my heart goes out to those small business owners that are in a position where they're seeing maybe their life's work vanish in front of their eyes, and they're desperate to try and get things back going.
All very well and good to say stay positive, but I mean, this is the toughest environment that we've probably ever seen, apart from, World War.
Yeah.
All right, Jeff Schlosser, the Executive Vice President of Bell Helicopters, Major General, retired. And Jimmy Blackman is the author of Cowboys Over Iraq. It's a great book. I just went through it the other night, and definitely worth reading from a leadership point of view, as well as a great insight into adventure. Thank you both so much for your time and expertise.
Great to be with you
Thanks,
today.
Dan.